The will reading happened on a Wednesday morning in the back office of a lawyer. Arlene Pruitt would forget the name of within a week. The room smelled like old carpet and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. Arlene sat in a vinyl chair with her purse in her lap. 30 years of night shifts at Mercer Regional had taught her how to sit still in an uncomfortable chair and wait for news that wasn't going to be good. Her son Brannon arrived 11 minutes late in a gray suit phone already in his hand before he'd taken his seat. Her daughter Cleo sat beside him, arms crossed, eyes on the parking lot through the window, like she'd rather be looking at anything that wasn't this room. The lawyer read through the standard language first. Arlene's mother Vera had been organized about her death the way she'd been organized about everything. Every item accounted for, every name assigned. The house on Greenfield Road went to Brannon. 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, the yard where Arlene had planted a dogwood the year her children were born. Brannon didn't react. He nodded once the way you'd nod at a weather report. The savings account just over $12,000 split between Brannon and Cleo equally. Arlene waited. And to Arlene Louise Pruitt, the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses, the property located at 4 Hollow Road, Mercer's Bluff, presently belonging to the estate of the late Theodore Kessler. Brannon looked up from his phone. That's the tower, he said. Uncle Teddy's old grain tower. That's correct. You're serious. He looked at Arlene, then at Cleo, then back at the lawyer. The county's been trying to tear that thing down for years. It's condemned. Nobody's been inside it in decades. You couldn't give that property away. The lawyer said nothing. He slid the documents across the desk. Cleo still hadn't looked up. Mom, Brannon said in the voice he used when he thought he was explaining something she couldn't figure out on her own. You understand what this is? It's a falling down stone tower on a flood lot nobody's farmed in 40 years. Grandma left you a ruin. Arlene picked up the pen and signed. Quick, steady, without looking up. Outside in the parking lot, Brannon caught up to her. Look, he said, I know some people who buy land like that for the materials. The stone alone might be worth something to the right buyer. I could make some calls. I'm gonna see it first, Arlene said. See what? It's a silo, Mom. There's nothing to see. She opened the door of her Buick, 14 years old, a dent in the rear bumper that had been there since Cleo learned to parallel park. The back seat held a folded blanket and a paper grocery bag with 2 changes of clothes. Most of what she owned, now the rest, having gone wherever the house on Greenfield Road's contents had gone the week before while she was still figuring out how to feel about any of it. There's nothing there, Mom. Then it won't take long. She pulled out of the lot and drove southeast. The drive took just under 2 hours. The highway narrowed past the city limits, the strip malls thinning into feed stores and small churches, and long stretches of fence line. The land rolled green and damp from a week of rain. Arlene had been on this road exactly once before, in the back seat of her mother's station wagon, 7 years old, riding out to visit her great-uncle on a Sunday in October. She didn't remember much of the drive. She remembered the gravel under the tires when they turned off the main road. She remembered the smell of dust and cut hay. She remembered her mother's voice from the front seat light, and amused telling Arlene's father that Uncle Teddy was a strange old bird, but harmless, that he'd never married, never seemed to want company, lived out past the county line with nothing but a dog and his own thoughts for company. She remembered everything about what Teddy showed her. He'd taken her hand and led her around the back of the house past the chicken coop to where the tower stood. He'd knelt beside her at its base and said, This is where I keep the things that matter, Arlie. Don't you go telling your mother I showed you. And he'd press something small into her hand, a wooden bird carved from a single block of wood wings, spread like it had just decided to fly and changed its mind halfway. She'd kept that bird for 61 years. It rode in her purse, now wrapped in a handkerchief, the one thing she'd taken from the Greenfield Roadhouse before the locks changed. The last half-mile of hollow road was unpaved. Trees closed overhead, turning the light green and dim. Then the road curved and the property came into view all at once, the way big things appeared in country like this. Not gradually, but suddenly, as if the land had been hiding it on purpose. The house came first. Single-story wood frame paint stripped down to gray boards by 40 years of weather. The porch sagged at its center. Plywood covered two of the windows. A yellow condemned notice dated 14 months earlier hung crooked on the front door. But it was what stood behind the house that made Arlene stop the car in the middle of the driveway and just sit there with her hands still on the wheel. The tower rose 45 feet into the gray afternoon sky. Round, built from fieldstones stacked and mortared in a tight spiral pattern that climbed the whole height of it, the work of men who'd known exactly what they were doing back in 1932, when grain silos like this one had gone up across half the county. The roof was a metal dome, once silver, now rusted to a deep blue-green, cracked open on one side, like an eggshell that had been struck from inside. Ivy climbed the lower 30 feet of stone in a thick green wave, decades of growth so dense it had become part of the structure itself, holding loose stones in place the way old scar tissue held together a wound that had never quite healed right. She had heard about this tower her whole life without ever truly understanding what it was. The Kessler Tower. Kids in 3 counties had grown up daring each other to walk out to it at night. Some claimed lights moved inside it after dark. Some claimed you could hear something in there knocking slow and patient, like somebody working with hand tools in a room with no windows. The county had scheduled it for demolition 3 separate times over the years and backed off each time the cost of bringing in equipment heavy enough to take down stone walls 4 feet thick at the base. On a lot nobody wanted to develop had never quite penciled out, so it had simply stood there year after year, getting more ivy and more rumors and less attention, until eventually it stopped being a building at all in most people's minds and became something closer to a local ghost story with a roof on it. And now it was hers. An old truck sat rusting on cinder blocks in the side lot. The yard had gone to waist-high weeds, and on the porch in a stripe of weak afternoon light sat a dog. A hound, brown and white long-eared ribs showing through a coat that hadn't been brushed in longer than Arlene wanted to think about. It lifted its head when her car pulled in but didn't bark, didn't run, just watched her the way a creature watches something it has been waiting on for a long time without knowing exactly what it was waiting for. Arlene got out slowly. Her knees complained. 30 years of standing shifts had left her with knees that complained about everything now. "Hey there," she said. The dog's tail swept once across the porch boards. A slow, careful wag like it had forgotten the motion and was relearning it in real time. She walked to the steps and sat down on the second one a few feet away. Didn't reach for the dog, just sat. "You Teddy's," another wag. Slower. "How long you been out here by yourself?" The dog looked at her with brown eyes that had clearly been watching that driveway for a long while, waiting for a particular kind of car that hadn't come. Then it stood, walked over, and pressed its bony shoulder against her knee. Arlene put her hand on its head. "Rufus," she said. She didn't know why that name arrived in her mouth. It just did the way some names did, fitting before there was any reason for them to fit. They sat together on the porch a while. The light shifted across the yard. A crow called somewhere in the tree line and went quiet. Rufus leaned into her hand and closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 weeks since the house had emptied out around her, since the locks had changed since she'd started sleeping with one ear, listening for a son who never came to check on her. Arlene felt something close to being somewhere she was meant to be. After a while, she stood, tested the porch boards with her weight, pushed open the front door. The smell hit her immediately. Mold, standing water somewhere close, wood gone soft from years of damp working into it from underneath. The front room was bare, a couch with the cushions long gone, an empty bookshelf, dust thick enough to write your name in. A faded calendar still hung on one wall, the page frozen on a month 4 years gone, the date never turned because there'd been no one left to turn it. A short hallway led toward the back of the house, and at the end of it, a door stood half open. Behind it, stone steps descending into black, and the sound of water faint lapping against something solid below. She pulled a flashlight from her purse, the same purse that held the carved bird and what was left of $52, and aimed the beam down. It hit black water, filling the basement to the third step from the top. The surface threw the light back at her in a flat, oily sheet. Cobwebs hung in heavy sheets from the joists above the waterline. The air rising up was cold and sour, but through the murk she could see something that made her stay there longer than the smell should have allowed. Walls that weren't poured concrete, edges too straight, too deliberate. Stone cut and fitted the same patient, careful work as the tower behind the house, as if whoever built one had also built the other and meant for the two to belong together. Not much to look at, the voice came from behind her. Arlene turned fast enough that her bad knee buckled and she had to catch herself on the doorframe. A man stood in the front entrance, tall, gray-haired, weathered, wearing a canvas work jacket that had clearly seen 40 winters. Late 50s, maybe 60. He wasn't smiling, but there was nothing unkind in his face either. Just a flat, assessing kind of watchfulness. "You the one who inherited this?" "I am." "Hollis Vance, live across the road. Been there since I remember. Didn't know anybody was coming for the property. Nobody told me until this morning." He stepped further inside and looked past her at the open basement door at the black water below. "That's been rising for years," he said. "Was about half full when Teddy died. Got worse every spring after that. Something's wrong with the creek line. Whole north side of this lot sits low now. Water just runs straight in like it's got an invitation. Has anybody tried to pump it out?" Hollis looked at her then. Really looked. "Pump it for what county's going to send the dozers in by spring soon as the ground firms up enough to bring the equipment. This place is done. Land's a flood risk on paper now. No bank will touch it. No builder will either." He glanced at the water again. "Whatever's down in that basement, it's been sitting under 5 years of standing water. Probably nothing left worth pulling out." "Teddy built something down there," Arlene said. Hollis waited. "I was 7 the last time I saw it, but I remember what it looked like." He waited for more. She didn't offer it. "All right," he said eventually. "I'm across the road if you need anything. White house with the green shutters. But if I were you, I'd call the county about salvage before they make the decision for you." He walked out. His boots were heavy on the porch boards, and then they were gone, and Arlene stood alone in the hallway with the flashlight beam still pointed down into black water, Rufus pressing warm against her leg. She thought about the bird in her purse, about 40 years of weather working at that stone tower out back while nobody asked what was inside it, about Brannon saying there's nothing there, Mom in a voice that had already decided the matter and didn't want her opinion on it. She thought too about her mother, who had organized her own death with the same precision she'd organized everything in life, and who must have known somewhere in some part of her that Arlene had never fully understood, that handing this property to her youngest daughter rather than her grandchildren was not an insult dressed up as inheritance. It was a decision. Vera had never been a sentimental woman. She wouldn't have given Arlene a ruin out of spite. She would have given her exactly what she believed Arlene could handle, and exactly what she believed Arlene deserved to be trusted with. Arlene didn't know yet whether that was true, but she intended to find out. She stayed. That night, she slept in the Buick parked beside the house windows, cracked the blanket spread over her legs. Rufus climbed into the back seat without being invited and curled against the door like he'd done this before for a man who used to be there and now wasn't. The temperature dropped into the low 40s. Through the windshield, Arlene could see the condemned notice on the front door fluttering slightly whenever the wind found it. She did not cry. There was no one to cry to, and crying wasn't going to fix the water in that basement or the look on her son's face when he'd called this place a ruin. She lay there a long while listening to the wind move through the dead grass, thinking about 30 years of 12-hour shifts, about raising 3 children mostly alone while their father worked himself into an early grave at the plant 2 towns over, about the particular exhaustion of being the dependable one in a family that had never once thought to ask if dependability cost her anything. She thought about Teddy, a quiet man who'd lived alone his whole adult life, who'd shown a 7-year-old girl a wooden bird and asked her to keep a secret, and who had then, as far as anyone in the family knew, simply faded into the background of their lives until he wasn't there to fade anymore. Somewhere around midnight, she finally slept. In the morning, she drove into Mercer's Bluff. One main street, a hardware store, a post office, a church with a white steeple gone slightly gray at the edges, and a diner with a hand-painted sign that read Della's in red letters that had faded to a tired pink. She went to the hardware store first. A sump pump cost $118. She put it on the credit card along with 50 feet of discharge hose, a box of heavy contractor bags, and a pair of rubber boots, a size too big because they were the only ones left on the shelf. The man at the register looked at her purchases, then at her. Working on something out there, draining a basement. Which property? The Kessler place. He paused with his hand still on the register. Ma'am, that's condemned. The house is condemned, Arlene said. The basement isn't anything yet. We haven't seen it dry. He didn't argue with that. He rang her up and she noticed him reaching for his phone before she'd made it out the door, the way news traveled fast and unkindly in towns this size. On the way back through town, she passed the diner again. A woman was sweeping the front step, gray-haired heavyset, watching Arlene's car with open curiosity. Arlene lifted a hand. The woman lifted hers back slow, like she was filing the gesture away for later. At the property, Arlene hauled the pump down the basement stairs and lowered it into the water by its cord. The pump ran off household current, so she rigged an extension cord from the Buick's power inverter, running it through the front door down the hall into the dark. The inverter ran hot. The flow was slow, maybe 200 gallons an hour if she was generous about it. But the water moved. She ran the discharge hose out through a ground floor window aimed downhill away from the foundation. Then she sat on the front porch with Rufus and listened to the small, steady hum of the motor and the trickle of brown water running out across the weeds. By late afternoon, the level had dropped maybe 4 inches. Hollis came back at dusk. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the hose draining muddy water into the yard. You're pumping it out. I am. With a car inverter. It's what I've got. That battery'll be dead before midnight. Then you're sitting out here with no car and a wet basement. Then I'll sit. He stood there a long moment, watching the water trickle out, something shifting slowly in his face. Then he shook his head more at himself than at her. Hold on. He walked back across the road. 20 minutes later, he returned carrying a portable generator in one hand and a second pump twice the size of hers in the other, a coil of heavy gauge hose looped over his shoulder. "This doesn't mean anything," he said, setting the generator down in the grass. "I just can't stand watching a woman run a sump pump off a car battery." "Thank you, Hollis." "Don't thank me yet. 5 years of standing water in a limestone basement could mean mold straight down to the bedrock. Could be nothing worth saving down there at all. Or it could be something worth draining." He grunted, hooked up the generator, lowered his pump beside hers. The combined pull was 4 or 5 times what she'd been running alone. The water swirled and churned around both intakes, brown and cold, and the hoses ran heavy out the window into the dark yard. Hollis wiped his hands on his jacket. "I'll check on you in the morning." "Hollis." He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "A flooded basement is just a room nobody cared enough to drain," Arlene said. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face softened into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to its neighbor. "We'll see about that," he said. He went home. Arlene sat on the top step with Rufus's head on her knee and listened to the generator's hum carry across the dark yard. The sky cleared. Stars came out sharp and thick overhead, the kind of sky you only got out past the last streetlight in a county like this. The air smelled like wet stone and turned earth, and something else underneath it, faint, almost sweet. Sawdust, she realized. Old sawdust, working its way up through years of standing water. Through the open basement door lit by her flashlight, propped on the top stair, she watched the walls come up out of the waterline inch by inch as the pumps worked through the night. They were not rough stone, not poured concrete. They were cut blocks, fitted tight edge to edge, clean squared seams with no mortar bleeding through anywhere visible. The kind of work that came from someone cutting every piece by hand and setting it exactly where it belonged with no rush and no shortcuts, because the man doing it had nowhere else he needed to be and nothing better to spend his patience on. Someone had built these walls on purpose. She didn't sleep much. She sat on the porch through most of the night, dozing in stretches, waking each time the pump's rhythm shifted, listening to the slow, steady work of machines doing what hands had clearly done first, decades before with infinitely more patience. By morning, the water had dropped another 2 feet. Arlene stood on the basement stairs in her oversized rubber boots and swept the flashlight across the surface. The water was brown and flat now, smelling of iron and old earth. But above the waterline, the walls stood fully exposed in the gray light coming down through the stairwell, and she could see them clearly for the first time. Every stone cut square, seams running straight and tight. Whoever had built this hadn't poured a foundation the way most men did out here. They'd built one block by block the way you'd lay up something meant to outlast you. Hollis appeared at the top of the stairs around 8, a thermos in one hand. "You eat anything?" "Had crackers in the car." He frowned. "There's a diner in town, Della's. She'll feed you." "I've got about $40 left to my name, Hollis." "I said she'll feed you. I didn't say it'd cost you anything." That afternoon, with the pump still running steady, Arlene walked the 8 miles into town. The Buick was nearly out of gas, and she didn't want to spend what little she had left on fuel when her own 2 legs would get her there eventually. The walk took just under 2 hours. Her knees ached by the time the main street came into view. Rufus walked beside her the whole way, unhurried, patient, like he'd been waiting years for someone to walk with. Della's was small. 6 booths, a long counter with stools, a kitchen visible through a pass-through window. The same gray-haired woman from that morning stood behind the register arms that looked like they'd carried 100,000 plates over the years. "You're the one out at the Kessler place," she said. "Word travels." "This is Mercer's Bluff. Word doesn't travel, it just arrives." She wiped her hands on her apron and stuck one out. Della Ruth. Arlene. Sit down. Arlene sat at the counter. Della didn't hand her a menu. She went to the kitchen and came back 5 minutes later with a plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a glass of sweet tea, so dark it was nearly amber. I can't afford this, Arlene said. Did I ask? Arlene ate. The meatloaf was the best thing she'd tasted in months, maybe longer. The tea was sweet enough to make her eyes water a little. How long you been out there? Della asked, leaning against the counter. 3 days now. By yourself. Me and a dog. Della studied her for a moment, the particular kind of looking a person did when they were deciding how much history to hand over to a stranger. Theodore Kessler was a good man, she said finally. Quiet but good. Used to come in here every Saturday, order the same thing, grilled cheese and tomato soup, and leave a $20 tip every single time. Never said more than 10 words the whole meal. That sounds like Teddy. People around here didn't know him well, but they knew he was decent. When he passed, a couple of folks drove out to the property, but the house was already condemned and the basement was flooded, so there wasn't much to see. She paused. What are you doing out there? Draining the basement. Why? Because I think Teddy built something down there. Something nobody's looked at in a long time. Della looked at her for a long moment. Then she wrapped 2 sandwiches in wax paper, dropped them in a paper bag, and slid it across the counter. For dinner, she said. And for that dog. Arlene walked back to the property with the bag in one hand and Rufus at her heel. The walk seemed easier heading home the way walks back always did, regardless of distance. Over the next 2 days, the water kept dropping. Hollis came by morning and evening, checking the generators, adjusting hose lines, saying little, but bringing gasoline without being asked, replacing a cracked coupling without making it a conversation. He had the kind of presence that filled in the gaps in a job without demanding anyone notice him doing it. On the second of those mornings, as Hollis topped off the generator's tank, Arlene found herself asking, "Did you know Teddy well?" Hollis considered the question longer than it probably needed. Knew him to wave at. He kept to himself. I'd see him out walking that dog along the road, sometimes evening hours mostly. We'd nod, maybe say a word or two about the weather. I don't think I ever stood in his house in 30 years of living across from him. He capped the gas can. Folks around here just figured he was the kind of man who preferred his own company. Didn't think much else about it. Nobody ever wondered what he did out here all day. Man's allowed his privacy, Hollis said. Then after a pause, though I'll admit, looking at what's coming up out of that basement, I'm starting to wonder if I should have wondered harder. By the 4th day since the pump started, the water in the basement had dropped to 8 inches. The floor was beginning to show through the murk stone, same as the walls, hand-laid perfectly flat. Hollis stood in the shallow water in his boots, looking around with the slow appraisal of a man who'd spent 30 years pouring concrete for a living. I've laid foundations my whole career, he said. Driveways retaining walls, footings for half the houses in this county. This is better than anything I've ever built. Whoever did this was working at a level most tradesmen don't even know exists. Teddy was a woodworker, Arlene said. At least that's what I remember. This isn't wood. This is stonework, a different skill entirely. Hollis ran his hand along the wall. He had time, a lot of it. By the 5th evening, the floor was dry. The basement was larger than it had looked from above, roughly 30 feet across, 20 deep, the ceiling clearing 7 feet. Every surface hand-finished. Walls, floor, the support columns holding up the joists overhead. But the room itself was empty. No furniture, no tools, no shelves. Just clean stone, and the damp smell of a space that had spent years underwater with nothing left in it to protect. Arlene felt her stomach drop. 5 days of work in an empty room. Maybe it washed away, Hollis said carefully. Arlene didn't answer. She swept the flashlight slowly across the floor corner to corner, and then she stopped. In the far corner, half hidden by the angle of a support column, there was a break in the wall. Not the floor this time, but the wall itself near where it met the foundation of the tower out back. A low arched opening, maybe 4 feet wide, framed in the same cut stone as everything else, with a worn stone lip along its bottom edge. And beyond it a passage, level, running straight, disappearing into a darkness that didn't end at any visible far wall. Hollis. He came over, followed the beam of her light into the opening. He didn't say anything for several seconds. "That's not part of the house foundation," he said finally. "That runs toward the tower." Arlene moved closer, crouching to look through the low arch. The air coming through it was different from the basement air dryer cooler and carrying that same faint sweetness she'd noticed the first night. Sawdust, old and patient and waiting. "Teddy connected them," she said. Quiet, certain in the way certainty sometimes arrived all at once fully formed. The house and the tower, he built a way between them. How long would that take, cutting a passage through solid rock by hand? However long he had, Arlene said. He had 40 years, Hollis. He had all the time in the world, and nobody ever once asked him what he was doing with it. She looked at the opening, at the dark beyond it, at the place where her great-uncle had spent decades of patient, unwitnessed work connecting a tower. The whole county thought was haunted to a house everyone had already written off. Building something nobody had thought to look for, because nobody had ever once believed a quiet old man with a dog on his porch might be hiding the most important thing in 3 counties right under their feet. "I'm going in," she said. Rufus, who had refused to come down the stairs the entire week, stood now at the top of them, looking down into the basement with his ears pricked forward, tail held still, the way a dog watches something it remembers and isn't sure it wants to remember. Hollis picked up the bigger flashlight. "Then I'm coming with you," he said. "Somebody's got to be the one who tells your kids what happened to you if this whole thing comes down on our heads." Arlene almost laughed. It surprised her how much she needed to even now, even standing at the mouth of a 40-year secret with cold air breathing out at her from the dark. She stepped through the opening first, because it was hers. Because somewhere over the last 5 days, she had stopped being a woman standing outside someone else's mystery and had become instead the person all of this had quietly, patiently been waiting for. The passage ran level for nearly 60 feet before it began to slope downward, the ceiling dropping just enough that Hollis had to duck his head, the walls tightening around them like the rock itself was deciding how much it wanted to let them through. Arlene counted the steps when the floor finally became stairs. Cut directly into the limestone, narrower than the basement steps, had been the risers, even the treads flat, despite having been carved by hand into solid bedrock. 22 steps. She didn't know why she counted them. Maybe because Teddy would have counted them too, somewhere back in 1976. Or whenever he'd first swung a pick into this rock, measuring his progress the way patient men measured everything, not in days but in steps completed one at a time, with nobody watching and nobody expecting him to finish. At the bottom, the passage opened. They stepped into a room that should not have existed under a forgotten grain tower in a county nobody outside it had ever heard of. The ceiling vaulted overhead in a long stone arch that ran the full length of the space, at least 60 feet, Arlene guessed, maybe 25 wide. The floor was smooth stone swept clean by drainage channels running along both walls. channels Teddy had clearly cut with the same patience as everything else, anticipating water decades before the creek line ever shifted to send it his way on purpose. Iron hooks hung from the ceiling. Shelves lined the walls floor to arch, built from heavy oak gone dark with age and oil. Two workbenches ran down the center of the room, their surfaces worn smooth with use. Tools hung from a pegboard along the near wall. Hand planes, chisels, mallets, saws, files, clamps, each one in its place. Each shadow outlined in pencil on the board behind it, so a man would always know exactly where a thing belonged, even in the dark. And on the shelves, on the benches, standing against the walls, and stacked in careful rows along the floor, was the furniture. Hollis's flashlight swept across it, and he stopped walking entirely. Chairs, a dozen of them, no two alike. Armchairs with flowing joints. Kitchen chairs with spindle backs turned on a lathe. A dining table with legs shaped like tree roots, the grain running in natural curves that looked grown rather than cut. Cabinets with dovetail joints so tight you couldn't find the seams with your fingernail. A chest with a lid carved in relief mountains. Trees a hawk caught mid-flight over a ridgeline. A child's rocking horse with a real horsehair mane, faded now but still recognizably. A mane still recognizably loved by whoever had brushed it smooth all those years ago before it ever left this room. Every piece finished, sanded, oiled, polished, ready for a home that in most cases had been waiting on a front porch somewhere without ever knowing who to thank. "My God," Hollis said. Arlene couldn't speak. She walked between the benches, running her fingers along the wood. The surfaces were cool and smooth under her palm. Some pieces were light birch maple, others dark walnut cherry, the kind of wood you only used when you had decades to wait for it to be worth the trouble. She stopped at a rocking chair set apart from the others near the back of the workshop. Dark cherry, a high curved back, wide arms, shaped to fit a person's elbows exactly. The seat had been carved to follow the shape of someone's body, and along the back, just below the curve of the top rail, someone had burned an inscription into the wood with a fine-pointed tool, "For the one who listens." Hollis had gone very still behind her. "Hollis." He didn't answer right away. When she turned, his face had changed completely. The steadiness she'd come to expect from him over the past 5 days was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear, though fear wasn't quite the word for it. "My wife had a chair like that," he said. His voice had gone flat, controlled in the way voices got controlled right before they weren't going to be controlled anymore. Cherry wood, high back, wide arms. She got it as a wedding gift, no card, no return address, just a note that said, "For your new home." She sat in it every night for 27 years. Arlene looked at the chair, then at him. "When she died," Hollis said, "I couldn't sit in it, couldn't even look at it most days. I put it out in the shed." He swallowed hard. "It's still there." Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "I always wondered who sent it," Hollis said. Arlene didn't have to answer. They both already knew. She left him standing there with the chair and walked the rest of the workshop's length, counting pieces as she went. 47. 47 pieces of furniture, each hand-built, each finished, each one waiting on a man's patience to find its way to a home he'd never visit to see it used. Some had inscriptions burned into hidden places. Most didn't, but every piece carried the same precision, the same invisible care. At the far end, against the back wall, stood a cabinet smaller than the others, maybe 4 feet tall, built from walnut, so dark it was nearly black. A single door, a brass lock, the door shut tight. Arlene tried it. Locked. She checked the tool board, the bench drawers, the small wooden boxes stacked in the corner. No key anywhere. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. "Brannon." She answered. "Mom, I talked to a guy who buys old lots like that for the materials. He'll go 8,000 for the stone alone, no inspection needed. That's real money for a flood zone parcel nobody else wants. Brannon, I'm just saying it's a good offer for what it is. I found Teddy's workshop. A pause. His what? It's under the basement, 22 steps down into the rock. He carved out a room the size of a barn and filled it with furniture he built by hand. There are 47 pieces down here, Brannon. Some of them are the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Silence on the line. Mom, the property's condemned. The house is condemned. What's underneath it isn't part of that. I'm not selling. You're sleeping in your car. $8,000 is real money. You're sleeping in the house I raised you in, Arlene said. And Teddy lived above a masterpiece for 40 years and nobody in this family ever once noticed. She paused. Including you. She hung up. The workshop air sat still and cool around her. Somewhere above faintly she could hear Rufus pacing at the top of the stairs, his nails clicking against the stone basement floor. He hadn't come down. He'd sat at the edge, whined once into the dark, then settled with his chin on his paws to wait. Arlene walked back to the locked cabinet, crouched beside it, studied the lock old brass well, made the kind you needed a specific key for, not the kind you forced open without ruining something worth keeping. Hollis came over. I could get that open, he said. Not yet. He looked at her. Whatever's in there, Teddy locked it for a reason, she said. I want to find the key first. I want to do this the right way. Hollis considered that, then nodded slowly. You think there's a key down here? I think Teddy didn't build all of this just to leave it sealed forever. I think he wanted someone to find it. And I think he wanted them to find it properly. From above, Rufus let out a low sound, not quite a bark, closer to a sigh, long and patient. A dog who had waited years for someone to come down these stairs and was willing to wait a little longer if that's what it took. He didn't build this for himself. The voice came from the top of the stairway. Arlene looked up. A small figure stood silhouetted against the daylight, filtering down an old woman, thin, leaning on a wooden cane. White hair, a face like a folded paper bag, but eyes sharp enough to cut through 40 feet of stone passage and land directly on Arlene without any trouble at all. Opal, Hollis said. I thought you were resting. I got tired of resting. She started down the stairs, one careful step at a time, cane tapping stone. Hollis moved to help her. She waved him off with a flick of her wrist that brooked no argument. She reached the bottom and stood in the workshop, looking around slowly. Her eyes moved across the shelves, the furniture, the tools hung exactly in their places. It's all still here, she said softly. You knew about this, Arlene asked. I lived across that road for 52 years. I watched Teddy come home from town every afternoon and disappear into that basement. I heard the saws running some nights late when the wind was right. I smelled the sawdust on the breeze coming off this property more times than I could count. She touched the nearest shelf with the tips of her fingers. He showed me once, about 3 years before he passed, made me swear to silence. Why? Because he didn't want the credit, didn't want people knowing where the furniture came from or the money or any part of it. He just wanted to build things, give them away, and be left alone with his own quiet. Opal's eyes found Arlene's. You haven't found the journals yet. The cabinet's locked. Opal reached into the pocket of her house dress and pulled out a small brass key dark with age. She held it out. He gave me this the last time I saw him, 3 weeks before he died. Told me to hold it until the right person came looking. She pressed it into Arlene's palm. He built this for whoever found their way down those stairs. I'm glad it was you, Arlie. Nobody had called her that since she was 7 years old. Arlene closed her hand around the key. It was warm from Opal's pocket, small enough to lose, heavy enough to feel like it mattered. She turned to the cabinet. The key slid in smoothly, like the lock had been oiled and waiting. The door swung open without resistance. Inside, stacked in neat rows across 3 shelves, were journals. Leather-bound, dark brown, each with a year embossed in gold along the spine. The oldest read 1976, the newest 2023. 47 journals, one for every piece of furniture in the room, though Arlene wouldn't understand that particular coincidence until much later, when she'd had time to think about how Teddy had organized his whole quiet life around the number 47 without anyone ever knowing the number mattered to him at all. She pulled the first one from the shelf and opened it. The handwriting was small and even, blue ballpoint, no decoration, no flourish. Just words set down the way a careful man kept records of something he took seriously. March 3rd, 1976, Arlene read aloud. Started the passage today. Cut through the basement wall where the rock looks softest. Don't know how long this will take or if it'll ever amount to anything. The tower's been sitting empty since Father stopped using it for grain. Seems a waste to leave good stone standing useless when a man's got nothing but time on his hands and no wife or children to spend it on. Hollis sat down slowly on one of Teddy's workbenches. Opal lowered herself onto the stool near the tool wall, her cane propped beside her. Neither spoke. Arlene turned pages. The early entries were practical, almost instructional. Teddy had taught himself stonework the same way he'd later teach himself fine woodworking, through library books and trial and error, documenting every mistake with the same plain honesty he applied to everything. A passage wall that collapsed twice before he learned to brace it properly. A drainage channel cut at the wrong angle that took him 3 months to correct. July 1976, she read on. The Henley boy from town came around asking, did I want help? Told him no. Don't need help with this. Need it to be mine, the doing of it, start to finish. He looked at me like I'd lost my senses. Maybe I have. A man can lose his senses quietly enough that nobody notices if he's careful about it. August 1977. Finished the first stretch of passage. 60 feet, give or take, sloping down into the limestone the way the old quarrymen used to cut. Found a vein of good stone about halfway through, harder than the rest. Took me 3 extra weeks just getting past it. Worth it. The stone on either side of that vein is the finest I've worked yet. But by the 4th journal, the entries changed. The technical notes remained, but alongside them, Teddy had started recording something else entirely. April 9th, 1979. Sold the walnut dining set through Pruitt's shop in Calder County, $1,800. Used $600 toward Arlene's mortgage payment. The rest goes to the reserve. Arlene stopped reading. My mortgage, she said quietly. Keep reading, Opal said. She turned the page. June 14th, 1979. Second payment to First Farmers Bank, $400 applied to the Pruitt account. They don't ask who's paying as long as the money's good. Arlene works the night shift and raises 3 children on her own. Least I can do is make sure she keeps the roof over them. The workshop went silent except for the faint drip of water somewhere far above the last of the drainage, finding its way through old stone. He paid our mortgage, Arlene said. Her voice stayed steady. Her hands did not. Not all of it, Opal said gently, but enough. When the payments fell behind, Teddy covered them. Always through the bank, always cash, always anonymous. The bank didn't care who paid as long as the account stayed current. Arlene set the journal on the workbench and opened the next one, then the next. She turned pages in silence, now eyes moving steadily down each entry. Hollis watched her face but didn't interrupt. The pattern repeated across every journal. Teddy built furniture. Teddy sold it through a dealer 2 counties east. The money went out not to Teddy, to other people. October 1982, she read. Heard from a fellow at the feed store that the caudal place burned in the storm last week. Family lost most everything. Sent a load of lumber and roofing tin out with a note. Figured you could use a hand. Didn't sign it. Don't expect they'll ever know it came from here, and that's exactly how I want it. December 1984. Built a cradle for the Tice baby. Don't know the family personally, but heard through Della that the husband lost his job at the mill same month the wife found out she was expecting. Sent it through the dealer, same as always. In 1995, a payment to the state college bursar's office. Arlene's hands went still. Brannon's scholarship, she said. What? Hollis asked. When Brannon turned 18, he got a letter saying he'd been awarded a merit scholarship to cover his tuition. He never applied for one. We assumed it was some kind of outreach program the school ran. She stared at the page. There was no scholarship. Teddy paid the tuition, $3,800 a semester for 4 years. She picked up the 1991 journal, next found the entry for November. November 3rd, 1991. Called the hospital about the Pruitt girl. Surgeon's fee plus 3 nights comes to $4,200. Insurance denied the claim. Sent a cashier's check this morning. Told them to let the family know it was covered by a charity fund. Cleo, 12 years old. An emergency surgery Arlene had been told was covered by a hospital charity program. She'd written a thank you letter to the charity office and never received a reply. She'd assumed they were simply busy grateful and moved on without ever thinking to question it. It had been Teddy. Arlene closed the journal and sat on the edge of the workbench, both hands flat on its leather cover, looking at nothing in particular. How much, she asked Opal, over all the years? How much did he give away? I don't know the exact figure, Opal said. He never told me and I never asked. But he worked in this shop every day for 40 years. He sold almost everything he built. And I never once saw him buy anything for himself besides groceries and hand tools. Hollis stood and paced the length of the workshop, running his hand along the tops of the chairs as he passed them. He stopped at the rocking chair with the inscription. My wife's chair, he said. How much did that cost him? He never charged for the ones he gave away, Opal said. The gifts were separate from the sales. He kept a list. People he knew needed something, people someone told him about. He'd build a piece and send it. No card, no name. A list, Hollis said slowly. I think I saw it once. A school notebook, names and dates. It was in the cabinet. Arlene turned back to the open cabinet. Behind where the journals had been stacked, she found it a spiral-bound notebook, the kind you'd buy for $1 at the drugstore. She opened it. Names, dates, descriptions of what was built and where it was sent. Entries going back decades. Vance, Hollis, and Ellen. Wedding 1996. Cherry rocking chair. Sent through the furniture dealer anonymous. Hollis took the notebook from her hands. Read the entry twice. Closed it. Handed it back. 27 years, he said. She sat in that chair for 27 years and never knew. Nobody spoke for a while. Arlene flipped further through the notebook, scanning names she didn't recognize. Families she'd never met, a county's worth of quiet kindness laid out in a teenager's school notebook bought for $1. The Hendersons, the Calloway family, twice, once for a cradle, once years later for a coffin small enough that Arlene's chest tightened, just reading the dimensions noted beside it. A teacher named Wirtz, who'd apparently mentioned to someone in passing that she couldn't afford proper bookshelves for her classroom, and 3 weeks later had 6 of them delivered through the school's front office with no explanation attached. Arlene went back to the journals, moving past the middle years now into the 2000s. The entries grew shorter, less detailed. Teddy's handwriting stayed clean but came less often. He was older. The work took longer. March 2003, she read. Hands aren't what they were. Took me twice as long on the dovetails this month as it would have 10 years back. Don't mind it much. Slower work is still work. A man my age learns to measure his days different than he used to. September 2011. 63 years old today by my own count, though I've stopped trusting the calendar to keep up with me properly. Built a child's desk this week for somebody's grandson name I didn't catch. Della passed the word along, same as always. Good oak should outlast the boy who uses it with luck. Then in the journal marked 2021, the tone changed. January 15th, 2021. Water in the northeast corner of the workshop. Seepage through the wall joint. Packed it with hydraulic cement, but it's coming back. Never had water down here in 45 years. Arlene read the next entries aloud, her voice steadier than it had any right to be. February 2nd. Seepage worse, not rain. Water table hasn't changed in 50 years. Something shifted the drainage. March 10th. Walk the creek line today. Channels moved. Used to run 30 yards east of the property. Now it runs straight along the north foundation. Somebody regraded the bank. Hollis sat up straight. Regraded. April 1st. A man came to the house today. Suit briefcase folder full of papers. Said he represented a development group interested in purchasing the property. I told him it wasn't for sale. He said they were prepared to offer $50,000. I told him the answer was the same at any price. $50,000, Hollis said, for a flood zone lot with a condemned house and a haunted tower nobody wanted. They didn't want the house, Arlene said. They wanted the land. She kept reading. May 19th. Water ankle deep along the north wall now. Coming in faster than I can manage. Move the furniture to the south side of the workshop. Drainage channels overwhelmed. Whatever they did to that creek, it's sending water straight at my foundation on purpose. June 7th. Called the county about the creek regrading. They said a drainage survey was conducted in March as part of a development feasibility study. Said it was routine. I asked who requested it. They said the file was incomplete. August 14th. Water's up to the 3rd stair now. Can't get down to the workshop anymore. Carried out what I could, 12 pieces. The rest is down there. 40 years of work. Hollis stood very still, arms crossed, jaw tight. September 2nd. My chest has been tight all week. Doctor says it's my heart. I told him it's not my heart. It's the water. The next few entries were short, a sentence or two each. Teddy's handwriting less steady now. October 1st. The man came back. Different suit, same company. Said the offer still stood. I told him what I told him the first time. He left. November 15th. I can hear the water at night. Even from upstairs I can hear it. The final entry in that journal. I don't know if anyone will ever read this. If you do, and if you've made it down those stairs, then you're either very brave or very stubborn. I hope it's both. Arlene's throat tightened. She turned to the last journal. 2023. Only a few pages used. January 3rd, 2023. Water's up to the basement door now. House smells like mold. Sleeping in the front room with the windows open because the air downstairs isn't fit to breathe. Rufus stays beside me. February 12th. They think they can drown what I built. They don't know how deep it goes. That was the second to last entry. The last one, dated February 26th, was only 2 lines. I'm tired. I hope Arlene comes. Opal had tears on her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. Hollis stood very still. Arlene turned to the back of the journal. A piece of paper had been folded and tucked inside the rear cover. She pulled it out, unfolded it. A business card. White with a blue logo, a company name she didn't recognize. Briarcrest Development Partners, land acquisition and site consultation. She turned it over. On the back, in Teddy's careful handwriting, a single letter. B. Arlene stared at it. The room went very quiet. The only sound was water dripping somewhere far above, and the slow tick of her own heart in her ears. She knew that letter. She'd known it somewhere in the back of her mind from the moment she'd read about the drainage survey and the man in the suit. But seeing it written in Teddy's hand made it real in a way nothing else had. B for Brannon. She folded the card and put it in her pocket next to the wooden bird. Arlene, Hollis said. She closed the journal, set it carefully back on the shelf with the others. I need some air, she said. She walked past him, past Opal, up the 22 stairs, through the empty basement, out into the daylight. Rufus was waiting on the porch. He stood when he saw her, pressed himself against her legs. She sat down on the steps. The afternoon sun was warm on her face. The yard was still half flooded where the discharge hoses had been running all week, the grass flattened and muddy. The condemned notice fluttered on the front door. She put her hand in her pocket, touched the business card, then touched the wooden bird beside it. Her son, her great uncle, and the water that ran between them, carrying everything Brannon had never bothered to ask about, straight into the foundation of the only thing in this family that had ever truly belonged to all of them. She sat on those steps until the light started to change, and she did not move, and she did not call her son because she did not yet know what she was going to say when she finally did. Hollis came out of the house around dark. He sat down on the step below Arlene without asking permission the way men of his generation did when they'd decided something needed saying and weren't going to wait for an invitation. Found out who flooded the basement, he said. She handed him the business card without a word. He turned it over, studied the initial on the back. Read that to mean Brannon, he said. That's what it means. Journal says a man in a suit came twice. Development company. Offered $50,000 for the land. Teddy refused both times, and the creek got regraded the same month as a feasibility study nobody filed proper paperwork on. Hollis turned the card over again, studied the company logo. You want me to check the creek myself? I poured concrete for 30 years. I know what a regraded bank looks like when I'm standing on top of it. Would you? Already planning on it. Opal stayed the night on a cot Hollis set up in the front room, too tired from the day's stairs to make the walk home, and in the morning before Hollis left to walk the creek line, she sat with Arlene on the porch a while. You're angry, Opal said. Not a question. I don't know what I am yet. Anger comes first, usually. Then it sorts itself into something with more use to it. Opal looked out at the yard. I watched your boy grow up some, you know. Used to see him out here as a child those few times your mother brought you all by. He had a quickness to him even then. Quick to want things. Slower to ask what they cost other people. That's a generous way of describing it. I'm an old woman. I've earned the right to be generous about things that don't directly concern me. Opal's eyes found hers. But you're his mother. You don't get that luxury. You'll have to decide what generosity costs you and whether you can afford it. In the morning, Hollis walked the creek line. He was gone 2 hours. When he came back, his boots were muddy to the knee, and his face had set into something hard. Used to run 30, maybe 40 yards east of the house, he said. There's still an old channel out there, dry, silted up, grown over with brush. But somebody cut a new channel through the bank and sent the whole flow straight at the north side of this property. The cut's clean, machine work, not erosion, done all at once, not over years. Could the county have done it? County drainage work leaves markers, survey flags, erosion fabric, permits posted at the access point. There's none of that out there. Whoever did this did it fast and never filed a thing. Arlene nodded slowly. What do we do about it? What do you want to do? She didn't answer that right away. She didn't rage. She didn't call a lawyer. She went down into the workshop and spent the day cleaning instead, wiping sawdust off the benches, oiling the tools, sweeping the stone floor with a broom Hollis brought over from his own shed. She moved the furniture back to its original places, matching each piece against the faint marks on the floor that showed where it had stood before the water, forced Teddy to rearrange his life's work into a smaller and smaller corner of the room he'd built with his own hands. Hollis helped without asking why. He carried the heavier pieces. He rewired two of the ceiling lights Teddy had once run off a generator hookup near the basement stairs, and for the first time in years, the workshop lit up the way it had been meant to: warm light, falling across wood and stone. The whole room finally looking like what it had always actually been, instead of what 5 years of standing water had tried to turn it into. Rufus found his way down the stairs that afternoon. He'd refused to descend all week, staying at the top, whining once into the dark, and then settling to wait. But something in the workshop now, some smell, some memory, drew him down at last. He walked the length of the room, slowly sniffing the legs of chairs and the corners of shelves, then lay down beside Teddy's main workbench and closed his eyes. He'd been here before. He'd just been waiting for the right day to come back. On the third morning, a truck pulled into the driveway. Arlene was in the workshop. She heard the engine and came up through the basement and out the front door. A pickup sat in the yard, engine still ticking. Brannon stepped out of the driver's side. He looked different than he had at the lawyer's office. Jeans now, instead of the suit, a gray fleece jacket, his face carrying the particular look of a man who hadn't slept well in several nights. Mom. Brannon. I heard about the workshop. People in town are talking. Are they? A woman at the gas station asked me if I was related to Theodore Kessler. I told her he was my great uncle. She said he'd paid for her daughter's school supplies every year for a decade. He paused. I didn't know what to say to that. Arlene stood on the porch. Rufus sat beside her. Can I see it? Brannon asked. She let him in. Down through the basement, through the low stone arch, down the 22 stairs into the workshop. She turned on the lights Hollis had rewired. Brannon stopped at the bottom of the stairs and didn't move for a long moment. The vaulted ceiling, the workbenches, the furniture lining every wall and shelf. This was under here the whole time. The whole time. He walked through the workshop slowly, touched the back of a chair, opened a cabinet door and closed it, picked up a mallet from the tool wall and set it down again like he wasn't sure his hands had earned the right to hold it. This is incredible, he said. Sit down, Brannon. He sat on one of the benches. Arlene went to the cabinet and took out 3 journals, set them beside him. Read these. What are they? Teddy's records, everything he built, everything he sold, and where the money went. Brannon opened the first one. He read in silence. His face didn't change for the first few pages. Then it did. The mortgage, he said. Keep reading. He turned pages, found the scholarship entries. This says he paid my tuition. There was no merit scholarship, Brannon. There was no outreach program. Teddy sold a walnut dining set and a set of cherry bookshelves, and he used the money to pay your college tuition for 4 years. His jaw worked. He didn't look up. And Cleo's surgery, Arlene said. November of 91. The hospital told me a charity fund covered it. There was no charity fund. Teddy sent a cashier's check. Brannon closed the journal, put both hands flat on the bench and stared at the wood grain. I didn't know, he said. You didn't want to know. The words came out quiet and they landed hard. He was your uncle, too. He lived 20 minutes from us your whole childhood. He was in this basement every night building furniture, sending money to cover things I couldn't afford on my own. And you never once visited him, not even when he was dying. His hands curled into fists on the bench, then opened again. You brought a developer to his property, Arlene said. His head came up. She pulled the business card from her pocket, set it on the bench between them. This was in the back of his last journal. Briar Crest Development Partners. Teddy wrote your initial on the back. Brannon looked at the card. His face went white. I didn't flood the basement, he said. The creek was regraded the same month your development company ran a feasibility survey on this property. Hollis checked the channel. Machine cut, no permits, no county markers. The water started coming in right after and it never stopped. I didn't know there was anything down here, but you knew the land was worth more than Teddy would ever take for it. And you knew the fastest way to make an old man finally sell was to make his home unlivable. Brannon stood, walked to the far end of the workshop and stood with his back to her shoulders tight. She could see his hands shaking from where she sat. I made a call, he said finally. Told the development group about the property, told them Teddy was old, the house was falling apart, the land would probably come open soon. They asked if I could help move the process along. I said I'd see what I could do. His voice thinned. I didn't tell them to redirect the creek. I didn't know they were going to do that. But you didn't ask questions when the water started coming in. He turned around. His eyes had gone red. No, he said. I didn't ask questions. The workshop was silent. He died 4 months after the water reached the basement door, Arlene said. His last journal entry says I'm tired. I hope Arlene comes. He wrote that 12 days before his heart stopped. Brannon sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, his hands over his face. Arlene didn't go to him. She didn't comfort him. She sat on the workbench and waited because she had learned a long time ago across 30 years of night shifts and harder conversations than this one, that the hardest truths didn't end with someone making you feel better about them. They ended with the truth sitting in the room and everyone deciding on their own what to do with it. After a while, Brannon spoke from behind his hands. What do you want me to do? I don't know yet. Do you want me to leave? Arlene looked at him. Her eldest son, the boy she'd worked double shifts to raise, the man who'd taken the family house and laughed at her inheritance. Not yet, she said, but I want you to sit here. I want you to look at what he built, and I want you to understand that the man you treated like nothing was the one holding all of us together. Brannon nodded. He didn't get up. He sat there a long while, long enough that the light through the stairwell shifted twice. Long enough that Arlene finally went back to her work, sweeping, oiling the small, steady tasks that had carried her through 5 days of pumping water out of a basement nobody else believed was worth the trouble. When he finally climbed the stairs and left, he didn't say goodbye. He simply went the truck, pulling slowly back down the gravel road, and Arlene stood on the porch and watched him go and felt nothing resembling resolution, only the particular exhaustion of having said a true thing out loud for the first time in longer than she could remember. 3 days later, a different truck came up the gravel road, newer, cleaner, with the magnetic door sign Arlene recognized before the man behind the wheel had even stepped out. Briar Crest Development Partners. The man who got out was around 50 in a tailored field jacket that had never seen actual field work, carrying a leather folder under one arm like a man who'd practiced the gesture in a mirror. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said, extending a hand she didn't take. "Garland Strode. I represent Briarcrest. I understand there have been some developments out here." His eyes moved past her toward the tower. "Quite the discovery from what I hear around town." "You heard right. I'll be direct. Briarcrest is prepared to substantially revise our previous offer. Given what's apparently down there, we're willing to go to 110,000 for the property, structures included. That's generous for a flood zone parcel, even accounting for whatever's in that basement." "It's not for sale." Strode's smile didn't move, but something behind it tightened. "Mrs. Pruitt, I'd encourage you to think carefully. Properties like this one can become complicated. Zoning reviews, structural assessments on a condemned building, liability questions about that tower, frankly, given its age and condition. These things have a way of getting expensive for the owner if they drag on." "Is that a threat, Mr. Strode?" "It's a business reality." Hollis stepped up onto the porch behind her arms, crossed, saying nothing, simply present in the way he'd been present all week. "Here's a business reality for you," Arlene said. "My great-uncle's journals document a feasibility survey your company conducted on this property in March of 2021, the same month the creek bordering this land was illegally rerouted without permits, sending floodwater directly into his home until it killed him. I have those journals. I have a neighbor who spent 30 years pouring concrete and can identify a machine-cut channel from natural erosion at a glance. And I have a county office I intend to visit this week." Strode's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's a serious allegation." "It's a documented one. You're welcome to wait and see how the county feels about it." He looked at her for a long moment, recalculating something behind his eyes. Then he closed the folder under his arm. "I think we're done here," he said. "I think we are." He got back in the truck and drove off without another word. The dust from his tires hung in the air a long while after the engine sound had faded down the gravel road. Hollis exhaled. "Didn't think he'd fold that easy." "Men like that don't fold," Arlene said. "They retreat. There's a difference. We'll see him again in a courtroom before we don't see him at all." She drove into the county seat the following morning, journals copied and bound at the library's machine, the spiral notebook photographed page by page on her phone, the business cards sealed in a plastic sleeve she'd bought at the drugstore for exactly this purpose. The clerk at the planning office listened to her for nearly an hour, made copies of everything, and told her with the carefully neutral voice of a civil servant who had clearly heard worse and would hear worse again that the matter would be referred to the county engineer's office for review. It wasn't satisfaction, but it was a beginning, the kind of beginning that took patience rather than triumph. And Arlene had 30 years of patience stored up that nobody had ever asked her to spend on her own behalf before. That evening, a gray sedan came up the drive, newer model, careful on the gravel. Arlene watched it park beside Brannon's truck, which hadn't moved in 3 days. Cleo stepped out. She looked thinner than Arlene remembered, hair shorter. She stood beside the car, hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the house, the yard, the tower rising up behind it all. Then she looked at her mother. "Brannon called me," she said. "Told me everything. About the workshop. About the journals. The development company." "Did he tell you about the creek?" Cleo nodded slowly. "Come inside," Arlene said. They sat at the kitchen table on the ground floor of the house, one of Teddy's pieces, a small drop-leaf table Arlene had brought up from the workshop 2 days earlier. The wood was warm under the light Hollis had wired in. Rufus lay on the floor between them, chin on his paws, watching both women with steady brown eyes. Cleo ran her fingers along the table's edge. Teddy made this. He made everything in this house worth keeping. Cleo pulled her hands back into her lap. She was quiet for a long time. I knew about the developer, she said finally. Arlene waited. Brannon told me about it 2 years before Teddy died. Said there was a company interested in the land and he was going to make the connection for them. I asked if Teddy knew. He said it didn't matter that Teddy would sell eventually, that the property was worthless anyway. And you said nothing. I said nothing. Cleo's voice had gone thin. I didn't think it mattered. It was Uncle Teddy's old place. I'd never even been out there. I didn't know what was in the basement. I didn't know any of it. You didn't know he paid for your surgery. Cleo's head came up. What? When you were 12, the emergency surgery. The hospital told me a charity fund covered the bill. There was no charity fund. Teddy sent a cashier's check for $4,200. Cleo stared at her. He's the reason you can walk without pain in that hip today, Cleo. He paid for it from a workbench in a basement you never visited, and he never told a single soul. Cleo's eyes filled. She pressed her fist against her mouth and looked down at the table. At Teddy's table. At the wood his patient hands had shaped for somebody he'd never meet, decades before he'd ever guess it would end up holding this exact conversation. I didn't know, she said through her fingers. Nobody did. That was the entire point of how he lived. I should have asked more, Cleo said. About Brannon's plan, about any of it. I let it be his business because it was easier than thinking too hard about what it meant. That's the part I keep turning over, Arlene admitted. Not just that he made the call, that you knew and decided it wasn't yours to question. There's a kind of silence that feels like staying out of something, and there's a kind that's really just looking away. I don't think you meant the second kind, but I think that's what it was. Cleo didn't argue. She sat with it the way Arlene had learned to sit with hard things, and after a while she nodded once, an acknowledgement rather than a defense. They sat together in the silence. The generator hummed somewhere outside. Wind moved through the trees, and far off an owl called once into the dark. Are you going to forgive me? Cleo asked. Arlene thought about it. She thought about the will reading about Cleo staring out the window at the parking lot while her mother was handed a ruin. She thought about phone calls that went unanswered for 2 weeks at a stretch. She thought about Teddy's last entry. I hope Arlene comes. You're here now, she said. That's something. The rest will come or it won't. But this is a start. Cleo reached across the table. Arlene took her hand. Neither of them said anything else for a while. There was nothing else that needed saying yet. In the morning, Opal came across the road moving slower than before. Hollis saw her from the porch and went to help, and this time she let him take her arm without arguing. They walked up the steps together, and Opal sat in the chair Arlene had set out for her. I'm not doing well, Opal said, plainly the way she said everything. Doctor says I've got a few months left, maybe less. Opal, don't look at me like that. I'm 84 years old. I've had a good run. She folded her hands in her lap. I came because I have one more thing to tell you. Something Teddy said to me the last time we spoke. Arlene sat across from her. He knew the water was going to take the workshop, Opal said. He knew he couldn't stop it, and he knew he was running out of time. Her voice stayed clear, no tremor in it at all. He said, if anything happens to me, Arlene will come. She's the only one who will ever come down those stairs. Arlene's chest tightened. He could have told anyone, Opal said. The county, a lawyer, the newspaper. He chose to trust that you'd come, and you did. You came with $52 and a sump pump, and you drained every inch of that basement. I almost didn't, but you did. That's the only part that matters now. Opal reached into the pocket of her house dress and pulled out a small wooden box. Cedar handmade the lid fitted so smoothly it whispered when she opened it. Inside a folded piece of paper. He gave me this with the key, Opal said. Told me to give it to whoever came looking after they'd read the journals. Arlene unfolded the paper, Teddy's handwriting. Arlene, if you're reading this, then the water didn't win. I built what I built because I had to. Not for money, not for recognition. Because a man should leave something behind that's better than what he found. The furniture is yours. The tools are yours. The workshop is yours. Do something good with it. Not for me, for whoever comes next. Love, Teddy. Arlene folded the letter and held it against her chest. Thank you, Opal. Don't thank me. Thank him. I just held the key. The dinner happened 3 days later. Della organized it. She closed the diner for the afternoon and brought everything out to the property herself. Meatloaf, cornbread, collard greens, 3 pies, 2 gallons of tea. Hollis set up folding tables in the yard. Opal sat in a lawn chair by the porch in her best house-dress cane propped against the armrest. People came. Not dozens, but enough for a town this size. 15, then 20, then 25, arriving in trucks and old sedans carrying covered dishes and coolers. Some had heard about the workshop already. Most had simply come because Della told them to. Arlene led them down to the workshop in small groups, watching their faces as they descended the stairs and saw the room for the first time. Most of them went quiet. A few reached out and touched the furniture, the careful way you'd touch something behind glass in a museum. A man in a flannel shirt stood in front of a bookcase, built from reclaimed barnwood for a long time without speaking. Teddy built my porch, he said eventually. After the storm in 2008, woke up one morning and there was a stack of lumber sitting in my yard and a note that said, figured you could use a hand. No name on it. I asked around for a year. Nobody knew. A woman in her 30s held up her phone, a photo of a small wooden writing desk on the screen. I got this when I was 16, showed up on my parents' front step with a note that said, for the one who reads. I thought my folks bought it and were just being mysterious about it. They swore they hadn't. She looked around the workshop slowly. The joints are the same. The finish is the same. It's his. An elderly man with a cane of his own, slower even than Opal, asked to be helped to a particular cabinet near the center of the room. He ran his hand along its surface and was quiet a long moment. My boy didn't come home from overseas, he said finally to no one in particular. This cabinet showed up the spring after, held the flag they gave us at the funeral. Never knew where it came from. Always figured it was the VFW doing something kind quietly the way they sometimes do. He shook his head slowly. Wasn't the VFW at all, was it? No, Arlene said gently. It wasn't. Story after story. The heating oil that arrived anonymously one hard winter. The school books that showed up through a teacher's office so a girl would think they'd come from some program. The furniture that appeared without explanation on porches across the county for 15 years running. No note, no name, no expectation of thanks. Teddy's notebook had all their names, and now one by one, those names stood in his workshop, finally seeing where it had all come from. Brandon stood at the edge of the crowd. He didn't speak. He didn't leave either. He watched and he listened, and when someone asked if he was related to Teddy, he said yes, and nothing more. The sun was going down when the last of the visitors climbed back up the stairs. Della was packing up the tables. Hollis carried folding chairs to his truck. Opal had fallen asleep in her lawn chair cane still propped against the armrest. 3 weeks after that, the county lifted the condemn notice. Arlene had filed a structural report Hollis helped her write documenting the foundation as sound and the drainage as restored. She filed separate paperwork establishing the property as a community workshop space. The clerk behind the desk looked at the forms for a long moment. You want to open a woodworking school, out at the Kessler Tower, in the workshop underneath it. Folks around here have called that place haunted for 40 years. It was never haunted, Arlene said. It was just loved by somebody quietly enough that nobody noticed until it was almost too late. The clerk stamped the paperwork without further comment. The county's separate inquiry into the creek regrading moved more slowly the way such things did, but it moved. A letter arrived in May confirming that Briarcrest Development Partners had been issued a formal notice of violation for unauthorized alteration of a natural waterway, with penalties pending further review. It wasn't justice in the complete sense Arlene might once have wanted, but it was a record official and permanent that what had happened to Teddy's home had not happened by accident, and that someone besides his family now knew it. 3 months later, the workshop was full. Chairs that had stood empty against the walls for decades were pulled up to the benches, now occupied by teenagers from the county's vocational program. A few adults, too, a woman who wanted to build her own bookshelves, a retired man who'd always wanted to work with his hands and never had the tools or the teacher. Arlene taught. She hadn't known she'd be any good at it, but 30 years of night shift patience and a stack of Teddy's journals had taught her most of what she needed. She followed his notes, used his tools, showed her students how to read the grain of a board with their fingers before they ever picked up a saw. Hollis helped with the structural lessons, how to think about weight and support before beauty, how to read a piece of wood for the places it would split and the places it would hold. He had a particular patience with the quiet students, the ones who sat in back and watched rather than talked. He'd pull a stool up beside them and work in silence until they were ready to join in on their own time. Brandon came on weekends. The first time he stood in the doorway for an hour and watched without saying a word. The second time he sat at a bench and picked up a scrap of wood and a chisel. Hollis showed him how to hold it properly. By the third weekend, he was building a small box, simple joints, rough edges, nothing close to Teddy's level of work, but built with his own 2 hands in the room his great-uncle had carved out of solid rock. He never talked about the developer, never mentioned the creek. He just kept showing up and kept working, and slowly across enough Saturdays to count as something more than guilt, Arlene began to see in her son the kind of patience that didn't announce itself. One Saturday in late spring, he finished the box, a small cedar thing lid hinged with brass he'd salvaged from one of Teddy's old hardware drawers joints, not quite square, but close enough that Hollis nodded approvingly when he inspected it. "What's it for?" Arlene asked. Brandon turned it over in his hands. "Thought I'd give it to Mom," he said, and then realizing what he'd said, looked up at her with something like embarrassment crossing his face. "I mean to you. I don't know. Seemed like the kind of thing you'd want. Something made instead of bought." She took the box from him. It was rough in places, the lid not perfectly even the kind of object that would never be mistaken for one of Teddy's. But he'd made it with his own hands in this room after everything, and that meant something different than craftsmanship. "It's good," she said. "It's a start." Cleo brought her 2 children out on a Saturday in June, a girl of 7, a boy of 9. They ran their hands along Teddy's carvings the same way Arlene had 61 years earlier in this very room. The girl found the wooden bird on the shelf where Arlene had set it beside Teddy's photograph. "What's this? Your great-great-uncle made it," Arlene said. "He gave it to me when I was your age." The girl turned it over carefully in her small hands. "Can I hold it?" "You can." The girl carried that bird around the workshop the rest of the afternoon, showing it to every student who'd hold still long enough, telling anyone who'd listen that her uncle had carved it from one single piece of wood a long time ago, before any of them were born. Arlene watched her and thought about Teddy kneeling on the floor of this room, placing the bird into the hands of a 7-year-old girl, trusting without any proof at all that it would matter someday. It had. Opal died on a Thursday in July in her sleep in the house across the road where she'd lived for 52 years. Hollis found her the next morning when she didn't come to the porch. They held a small service at the church in town. Arlene spoke. She told the story of the brass key, the journals, the letter Teddy had left behind. She told them Opal had kept a promise for 3 years waiting for the right person to come looking, and that without her the workshop would still be sitting underwater, unfound, unfinished. Just another rumor about a tower nobody bothered checking on anymore. After the service, several of Opal's own family members, a niece from 2 counties over, a great-nephew Arlene had never met, found her at the back of the church and asked quietly if they might see the workshop sometime. Arlene told them they were welcome any Saturday at all. It seemed in some unspoken way like exactly the kind of thing both Opal and Teddy would have wanted, the circle widening rather than closing, one more name added to a list that had always somehow intended to keep growing. After the service, Arlene walked home alone. Rufus met her on the porch. She sat down and put her hand on his head and let herself be still a while. The evening was warm. The yard was green, now mowed short, the mud and weeds replaced by new grass. The windows had glass in them again. The porch didn't sag. The condemned notice was gone, replaced by a small hand-painted sign that read, Kessler Tower Community Workshop. Through the open front door she could hear the house settling, and below that, fainter, the sound of tools at work. Hollis was downstairs doing what he did most evenings, now oiling the hand plane, sweeping the floor, keeping the space ready for tomorrow's students. Arlene reached into her pocket. The wooden bird was there. It had been there every day since she had arrived with $52 and a dog and nothing else to her name. She thought about Teddy's letter. Do something good with it. Not for me, for whoever comes next. She thought about the people who'd sat at those benches, the teenager who built her first bookshelf and cried when the joints held true. On the first try, the retired man who made a cutting board for his wife and brought it in just to show everyone, the students who kept coming back week after week because someone had finally given them a room where what they built actually mattered to somebody. She thought about what Teddy had told her when she was 7 years old, kneeling at the base of a tower the whole county thought was empty. This is where I keep the things that matter. He'd been right the whole time. It was all still here. The tools, the furniture, the stone walls, the stairs going down. And now there were people in the room, too. People who'd come looking just like Teddy had always hoped somebody eventually would. Arlene sat on the porch with Rufus beside her and the bird in her hand. The stars were coming out, the same stars she'd watched through her windshield that first night when she'd had nothing and nobody and a basement full of black water waiting on her to either give up or start pumping. Being forgotten doesn't mean you didn't matter, she thought. Sometimes it just means you were so quiet about your kindness that nobody thought to say thank you while there was still time. She went inside, walking down the hall, through the basement, through the low stone arch, down the 22 stairs into the workshop. The lights were on. Hollis was at the far bench running a cloth along the surface of a table. He looked up. Students tomorrow, she said. I know. She picked up a chisel from the tool wall and set it at the bench where she taught. Straightened the stool, placed the wooden bird on the shelf beside Teddy's photograph, the one Opal had given her, a young man with steady hands and quiet eyes looking back at all of them across 40 years, like he'd known somehow that this exact moment was always going to be waiting for him at the end of it. The stairs went up to the daylight. The stairs went down to the work. Both open, both used, both finally exactly what they were always meant to be.